Thank you very much. Well, what an excellent series of presentations. And I think following on from Ian, the challenge globally has to be decoupling resource use from economic activity, not just growth, but economic activity. So we're talking not just about relative decoupling, so you can grow using slower growth in commensurate resources, but absolute decoupling, so that you use resources and reuse resources in a way that's sustainable, that works with the Earth's ability to either supply or recycle those resources or substitute out of those resources. So we're talking about absolute decoupling. And that's clearly going to be very difficult because I agree with Ian, there are vast parts of the world with billions of people in poverty who will and rightly should aspire to having living standards somewhat closer to those of our own. It's just that they will need to get to those kinds of living standards with a substantially reduced resource use. And, as you might imagine, that is going to be extremely challenging over the next century. We do have one thing going for us, and it's a very important thing going for us. Even though resources are finite for the most part, one of the most valuable resources in driving growth is infinite and weightless, and that's knowledge. And from knowledge you get innovation. And the only way you're going to decouple in an absolute sense is to improve the intelligence with which we use resources, the technologies with which we apply to production, the processes, as well as the behaviors and the cultural demands from the household and consumer end as well. The nice thing about knowledge is it is not just limitless, it actually is subject to what are called economies of scale. Knowledge begets knowledge. It's a sort of Newtonian phrase of standing on the shoulders of giants. We learn from experience, and that learning tends to go only in one direction, and it's one that helps us use resources more smartly. A lot of the barriers will not tend to be technological or economical. They will tend to be cultural, institutional, and behavioral. We need to get people to demand less, but we know that there are limits there. We need to get manufacturers to use fewer resources. We need to get manufacturers to think not only about assembly, but disassembly, and making recycling and reusing a heck of a lot easier. That requires strong leadership. It requires strong leadership from central government, from local government, but also from business leaders. Even that is not going to be enough. You might have strong leadership from business leaders, but when it goes down the production process, there's a middle manager there whose contract and whose bonus and whose job depends on getting the stuff out quickly in the easiest manner, the way they've been doing it for years. And somebody telling them you've got to change and you've got to reskill and retool your workers and use new technologies and change your behaviors, and possibly even increase the cost of the product you're dealing with to the consumer, at least in the short run, they're probably going to try and avoid and block that kind of progress. And sometimes the most ambitious leadership gets stymied going down the production process. So you need incentives, you need pricing. One of the reasons, the main reason we've become so greedy in the use of global resources is that they're not priced to reflect their scarcity. We see that in the atmosphere, we see that with fish, we see that with rare materials. But you need more than pricing. You need standards and regulations. You need support for technologies, and you need an open discussion and a common understanding of the problem so that you get political support to drive the kind of change at a political level. And finally, to end on the macroeconomy, people might respond, well, yes, this is all very well, but maybe now is not a very good time to be talking about pricing and extra costs and standards and regulations when we're all in a recession. This is perhaps something that we might want to wait a couple of years before addressing. That is fundamentally and absolutely wrong. In fact, now is an a unique opportunity to undertake these kinds of investments. We're in what's called a paradox of thrift, where everybody is saving like crazy. It's the rational thing to do at an individual level. If you're somewhat dubious about the economic outlook as a household, a sensible thing to do is to put some money away for a rainy day. So you cut back on spending. Businesses cut back on investment, and they cut back on employment. Banks cut back on extending credit. The problem is when everybody does this simultaneously, those expectations become self-fulfilling because somebody's spending is somebody else's income. So, of course, the recession materializes, and then you enter another round of retrenchment. When government starts retrenching as well, partly because it spent a lot of the money in the bank in the good days, and it didn't counter the consumer boom at the time when it should have done, then, of course, you end up in this position where private savings have actually risen to record levels. Net financial balances in the UK stand at about 100 billion pounds. In the US, $1 trillion. These are historic post-war levels, not just in absolute terms, but as a percentage of GDP. At the same time, investment is at historic record lows, both in terms of total investment but also business investment. This glut of saving has actually driven risk-free interest rates below zero in real terms. If you look at US Treasury yields for the next 20 years, they are under 2%, which is less than the expected rate of inflation. This money has nowhere to go. This collapse in risk-free real interest rates does not reflect a collapse in global returns to capital for 20 years. It reflects a collapse in confidence. So how do you get round this confidence effect, and how do you leverage private investment at a time when resource costs are uniquely low, when there's virtually no crowding out because there isn't any investment, so additional investment won't crowd out investment elsewhere. A green job won't crowd out an alternate job elsewhere. It would have done 5 years ago when the economy was operating at full capacity, but now it won't. There are spare resources as unemployed labor. How do you leverage that private investment? You need something that captures the business's imagination, that is long-term credible. I mean, I challenge you to think of a sector that's going to be more long-term credible and dynamic in the 21st century than using resources more efficiently, and that's big enough and has a transformative scale to capture business confidence. In the past, there's been electrification, there's been going to war with your neighbors, there's been space races. This time, the challenge has to be resource efficiency. And all it requires is a clear signal from government, like I say, pricing, regulation standards, and so on. By the way, none of these are particularly call particularly heavily on the public purse. In fact, carbon pricing and carbon trading can raise revenues. So these are clear signals, so long as they're credible, so long as businesses believe them, that can leverage in those huge sums of private saving into something that leaves a lasting legacy. And if we don't do it now, in 5 years' time, we'll look back and we'll really kick ourselves for missing that opportunity.